Quiet, please. We are about to begin our afternoon session, and I'd like to remind you to please fill out the survey forms that are on the tables after the session is over. Feel free to ask questions at the end of the session, and please turn your cell phones off. We would like to thank the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, PKSOI, for bringing Colonel Bryan Groves to the second annual GRCC Peace Studies Conference. When a number of us were out to dinner the other night and we raised our glasses of Italian red wine, Bryan toasted to peace in our time. Perhaps not a toast one might expect from a decorated Army officer, but one that might be essential and far too often forgotten. Colonel Groves is currently Chief of Civil Military Integration at PKSOI with considerable experience in peacekeeping operations. He's worked with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the United Nations Mission in Kosovo, as well as other UN agencies during 2 tours in Kosovo. His service in support of the 1st Marine Division, 82nd Airborne with the 304th Civil Affairs Brigade in Iraq resulted in vital infrastructural improvements and enhancement of Iraqi security forces. Among other things, his service as Assistant Chief of Staff Civil Affairs for the 19th Expeditionary Support Command and 8th Army in Korea was notable, and his research on civil military operations in support of counterinsurgency operations in Korea and Vietnam has lent keen insight into analysis of asymmetrical warfare, civil affairs, and peacekeeping across the globe, which is reflected in a number of his articles and highly informative blog. The latter, incidentally, includes 11 article-length referenced entries which make for a valuable online anthology, and I urge you to look at it if you haven't already done so. Among his publications are a variety of works. Markedly, Colonel Grove has also written on the necessity of embedding civil affairs companies as organic elements in brigade combat teams, maintaining that, quote, just as stability operations are critical to achieving lasting peace, civil affairs is critical to effective stability operations. Enough said. We're honored to welcome Colonel Groves as a plenary speaker. Colonel Groves, to peace in our time.
I want to thank Mike DeVivo for a very generous, maybe overly generous welcome and introduction. And I want to thank Grand Rapids Community College for having me here. And it's an honor to speak here at your second annual Peace Conference. And because the theme of this conference is conflict resolution, challenges, successes, and failures of supranational and international organizations, I'll try to address some of the challenges, successes, and failures of the United States has experienced in the realm of peacekeeping, to include direct participation by U.S. service members in peacekeeping operations since the Korean War, and our nation's support to other nations participating in those operations. A bit about the Peacekeeping Stability Operations Institute, or PKSOI. We've been in existence since 1993 at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, stood up by the Army Chief of Staff then because he saw peacekeeping as an important mission for the United States Army. We work continuously with the Pearson Peacekeeping Center in Canada. We work with the United States Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C., and a lot of the other service schools in the United States and with our allied countries. We have a website that Mike mentioned. If you go to our website, and the URL is on the bottom of this slide, you can join up to our Stability Operations Lessons Learned information and management system. And basically, that's where we collect lessons learned from anyone that's been involved in peacekeeping, peace building, or stability operations missions, and doesn't require a security clearance or a special encrypted card. You can set up an account and you can read what's there. And once if you actually participate in those operations professionally and you have something to contribute, something you observed, we always welcome those observations. And we also publish a online journal or bulletin on a quarterly basis, and we always look for other perspectives on peacekeeping and stability operations from outside the U.S. military, from outside the United States. So, welcome anyone with expertise there to contribute to that. This is the outline I'm going to follow. It's going to talk mostly about peacekeeping operations that the United States has participated in since World War II and the support that we provide to the United Nations in regional peacekeeping operations. It's not all inclusive, but it's pretty inclusive. The first one I want to talk about is our mission in Korea. It's not usually considered or universally considered a peacekeeping operation, but we have 28,500 American servicemen and women assigned to the United States Forces Korea, and they represent America's contribution to the United Nations Command. And the United Nations Command has helped maintain peace on the Korean Peninsula since 27 July 1953 when the armistice was signed. And here you see that's the United Nations Color Guard. It's got soldiers from the United States, Republic of Korea, and Thailand in it. On occasion, it might have a Canadian soldier, a Belgian soldier in that, but it's the United Nations Color Guard. And again, it's not often thought as a peacekeeping operation, and you won't see anything about United Nations Command on the United Nations website or the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations website either. But for budget reasons, the Secretary of Defense in his report to Congress details our contribution to the United States Forces Korea as part of our indirect contributions to United Nations peacekeeping operations. And this is the United Nations Command today. And all those flags around the left and right side and the top represent the nations that originally fought under the United Nations Command between 1950 and 1953, and who still have some representation there. And the nomenclature, you'll see some, it looks like a fraction, it's not a fraction. For instance, under Belgium, you see a 0/1. That just means that the Belgian military continually has one non-commissioned officer there observing and participating in United Nations Command training and exercises, whereas Australia has one officer and no NCOs there on a regular basis. And of course, the United States has 28,500 approximately, give or take. It varies from day to day because people come and leave. And then, of course, Republic of Korea has about almost 600,000 people in active duty, and then within the reserves, they've got close to 2 million, still dwarfed by the North Korean military. Along the bottom, you see the flags of Sweden, Switzerland, and Poland. And as Karen noted, Sweden and Switzerland were two of the holdouts in the EU Lisbon Treaty because of the importance of neutrality. And of course, their history of neutrality has served them well in their mission at the United Nations Supervisory Commission. And what they do is they monitor complaints between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or Communist North Korea and the Republic of Korea. Poland is there prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia, which no longer exists, also used to be a member of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. The primary mission of the United Nations Command is to monitor and supervise the implementation of the armistice agreement, and the main role is to provide a separation of the forces of the Republic of Korea and North Korea to prevent renewed combat. The military demarcation line that you see there on the map and the demilitarized zone are the main mechanisms that provide for the separation of these two enemies. Technically, there's no peace treaty between these two countries. They're technically still at war. The truce village, or the joint security area near Panmunjom, was created to provide a venue for North Korean People's Army and the United Nations Command reps to meet and talk and resolve issues related to the armistice. And I would say, back to our theme about successes, failures, and challenges, I would have to say that this is a success. Although North and South Korea are technically still at war, the armistice is held, and there's been relatively little bloodshed since the armistice was signed. And I say relatively little blood shed. About slightly over 100 American servicemen have died since the signing of the armistice. Some of the older people in the room might remember the 1976 axe murder of Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett. It happened at Panmunjom. And since the signing of the armistice, approximately 4,000 Korean soldiers, policemen, and civilians have died as a result of violence. But when you compare that to the fighting that took place between 1950 and 1953, where over 2 million civilians alone died, over 36,000 American soldiers died, and over 200,000 Republic of Korea soldiers died, it's a big improvement. The Sinai is, I don't know how many people here remember the Carter administration. I think probably half the room was probably born after that fact. But one of President Carter's great accomplishments was the Camp David Accords, which were a follow-up to peace treaty that he helped arrange between Israel and Egypt. Egypt and Jordan were the two Arab countries that recognized Israel's right to exist and have a peace treaty with them. But the comfort level was not there without having a peacekeeping force to separate these two former combatants. And so following the treaty and the Camp David Accords, Congress passed a multinational force observers resolution, or the United Nations did rather. And today 12 countries actually provide soldiers for this. And the United States is the single largest troop contributor to that. Right, we provide about 700 of over 1,700 multinational troops to this mission. We provide an infantry battalion of 425 soldiers and a support battalion that includes 8 to 10 helicopters, medical support, explosive ordnance disposal support for all 12 of the other countries that supply troops for this. There's 2 other additional infantry battalions. One comes from Colombia, another one comes from Fiji. The other countries that participate in this are Australia, Canada, France, Hungary, New Zealand, Norway, and Uruguay. There's a Czech Republic was, I think, the latest country to start sending troops to this. And the Italian Navy usually provides 3 ships to patrol the waters near the Sinai. And this map here shows where the forces all are. All 1,700 of these multinational soldiers are in what's called Zone C, which is to the right-hand side of the map as you look at it. In Zone B, you actually have 4 Egyptian border security battalions. In Zone A, the Egyptians have a mechanized infantry division. And in Zone D, the Israeli forces man that area. So there's not total trust, and you can see the importance of those 1,700 multinational peacekeepers. And I'm kind of in awe of this morning's presentation about what happened in Kashmir, where with merely less than 50 military observers and less than 50 civilian support staff, they're able to provide a relative peace on a much longer border. But this is still a good accomplishment, I think. And it's prevented a major war between Egypt and Israel. And both Egypt and Israel are major U.S. allies. And I think that's something to mention, that it's not just the presence of these multinational force peacekeepers. There's foreign aid plays a part. Israel and Egypt are the two largest recipients of U.S. foreign aid, and that includes a lot of technology transfers to both those countries. So I would say that to categorize this, I would categorize this as a success, because it has kept the peace between two nations that otherwise might be still engaged in bloody combat, not unlike what Israel still goes through today with Lebanon and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And speaking of Lebanon, we first intervened actually in 1958 on behalf of the Lebanese government, before the Palestinian issue had really become a problem for that government. And we sent in about 14,000 Marines to help keep that president in office during a tough time he had. But this intervention was in the wake of the Lebanese Civil War that began in 1975. And again, that was all related to the Palestinian conflict. You had a large number of Palestinian refugees and Palestinian fighters that had moved from Palestine into Jordan, into Lebanon. Jordan forced out all these Palestinian refugees because they became a challenge to the Jordanian state. And so this swelled the number of Palestinian refugees that were in Lebanon, and they set up their own, almost a sub-state, and this ended up a very bloody civil war that lasted for many, many years in Lebanon. In 1976, the president of Lebanon happened to be a Christian, actually invited the Syrian army in to help him take control of the security situation. And at the same time, there was cross-border activity between Hezbollah, or what would become Hezbollah, and the Israeli military. And this is something that President Carter tried to address at Camp David, and it's something that the Reagan administration took up as well. And President Reagan sent Philip Habib as his special envoy to the Middle East to try to arrange a peace in Lebanon. And what he tried to do was get the major state parties, Syria and Israel, to withdraw their military forces from Lebanon, and so he could help reestablish the sovereignty of that nation. And so that was the substance of the agreement. And part of that agreement was to provide another multinational force that would help separate the combatants and help evacuate the PLO fighters. And most of the PLO actually left in about a 3-week period, went by boat to I think Tripoli, I believe in Tunisia. And within the United States government, there were some coordination errors that were made, and immediately after the PLO evacuated by sea, Secretary of Defense Weinberger ordered his Marines back on their boats. So the Marines that had been in Lebanon to escort the PLO out and separate the combatants got back on their boats. And then we had the incident in Sabra and Shatila less than 2 weeks later, for about, estimates vary, but generally accepted by the International Committee of Red Cross, 800 Palestinian refugees, and many of them were family members of the PLO fighters that had just been evacuated, were killed by a phalangist militia with the support of the Israeli military. The Israeli military did not prevent it, and so, of course, it's a big stain on the honor of the United States. We went there to protect these people. So immediately, we sent the Marines back in. We tried to establish the zone of separation, and we increasingly got caught in crossfire. And our response was eventually to have the U.S. Navy protect our Marines and our embassy with naval gunfire and even airstrikes. And of course, this was just shortly after our withdrawal from Vietnam, and Congress threatened the Reagan administration with a War Powers Resolution because they thought it was an inappropriate use of military force, and they didn't want to get America caught up in another quagmire. I'd have to say during the winter of 1982 and 1983, this force was a success. It was obviously, I would say, it was a failure when it did not prevent Sabra and Shatila, however. And though it was officially neutral, our Marines and our civilians on the ground got increasingly caught in the crossfire. And when we started to respond with naval gunfire and airstrikes, we became almost a party to the conflict, and we were no longer a neutral force. And so this is a problem. And most of the fire that we received, almost all of it was from predominantly Shia Muslim or Druze militia, and so they received the brunt of our return fires. Again, initially successful, we failed because we withdrew early, and because of the massacre that occurred during that vacuum, that was a failure. We did, after return, helped deliver humanitarian assistance, especially during a particularly harsh winter. We actually used a lot of Marine helicopters to deliver rations and blankets and such to people who were otherwise might have frozen or starved to death that winter. But there was not sufficient civilian support for this back home. And over a series of time, we had 3 separate bombings. First in April of '83, where about 60 people at our embassy were killed. And again, another car bombing at our consular building in September that killed about 8. And then October '83, we lost 241 Marines. And then President Reagan kind of conceded. He took responsibility that he hadn't handled it right, and withdrew our Marines in February of 1984. So some success, but for the most part, this was a failure for us. We did not accomplish the withdrawal of either the Israeli or the Syrian forces. We didn't protect civilians as well as we had wanted to. And we were slow learners. I mean, 3 car bombs. We're much quicker now at protecting our forces and protecting others. Let's see. This is an interesting mission. It followed right after the first Iraq War. And I read an interesting quote that one defense staffer had said to another that if you liked Beirut, you will love Mogadishu. And the thought was that as bad as Beirut was for the American military and American government, a lot of people within our governments thought that this would be a much more challenging situation. And this was an effort of peace enforcement. It was an armed intervention in a conflict without the consent of a state authority or any of the parties to the conflict. At this point, there really wasn't a state authority in Somalia to get consent from anyway. But in November of 1992, the United States of America offered to establish a multinational force under its own leadership to secure the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And this offer was accepted by the United Nations Security Council, and it became known as Unified Task Force, or UNITAF, and it got some of its legitimacy from the United Nations Security Council Resolution 794. This task force was composed of forces from 24 different countries, but the United States military contributed about 30,000 soldiers and Marines to a force that would eventually grow to 37,000 at its peak. And this was a force that went in to support UNISOM, or United Nations mission in Somalia, which was a much smaller force initially. And that was also a force that had a civilian component. It was supposed to try to do development and humanitarian assistance. And it was initially successful, and it did help create a secure environment for delivery of humanitarian assistance. That was a specific goal of it, and it was a goal that it did meet. Somalia had and still has many challenges, and for UNITAF, I think the changing nature of the mission was the one that caused the greatest challenge. UNITAF, with its 37,000 soldiers and Marines, it had enough manpower, it had enough equipment to accomplish its original mission of securing the environment for the safe delivery of humanitarian assistance. It did not have enough manpower, though, for its expanded mission, and that was the mission that was given to it of disarming the warring militias. And the October 1993 raid that has been immortalized in the movie Black Hawk Down goes partly to that issue of trying to demobilize militias, and besides the expanded mission, that particular mission itself was not coordinated well between United States Special Forces, the United States conventional forces, or the Pakistani conventional forces on the ground. And basically the 10th Mountain Division and the Pakistani Army that was in Mogadishu didn't know that this raid was going to happen. And also, American commanders on the ground had asked Secretary of Defense Aspen for additional equipment. They wanted armored vehicles. They wanted M1 Abrams tanks. They wanted Bradley fighting vehicles that would allow them to safely move into Mogadishu, where the militias were heavily armed with heavy machine guns and rocket launchers and such. And for political reasons, that had been denied because we didn't want to widen the conflict. And so when the 10th Mountain Division and the Pakistani Army tried to rescue our Rangers, they didn't have heavy armor. The Pakistanis had some aluminum-hulled armored personnel carriers that would no way stop the bullets that the militias had. So after the October 93 raid, we initially reinforced this mission, but then in 1994 we began to withdraw. And in 1995, UNISOM II withdrew, which was a smaller follow-on mission. So I'd have to say that, the challenges we had, that the mission changing from just securing humanitarian assistance to actually trying to change the internal politics of Somalia by disarming heavily armed militias was a severe challenge. And overall, we have to evaluate this as, in many cases, a failure for us because we didn't go in with the right equipment and we didn't control the mission that we gave our forces. And this had significant impacts for us in future operations. Initially, when we tried to go into Haiti, Haitians who had seen what happened to us in Somalia were able to keep us from landing forces there to help. This also made the United States government very hesitant to do something about Rwanda, even though they had early indications that there was going to be mass murder, organized mass murder committed there in Rwanda. They were very hesitant to get involved because of what had happened to us in Somalia. It's also affected our response in Bosnia. We were slow to respond to what was happening in Bosnia initially because of what happened to us in Somalia. Haiti's an interesting one, and this slide's incorrect because I say when I talk about interventions, this is really not the first intervention in Haiti. It's the first armed intervention that we've had in my lifetime. But those who've studied Haiti know that the United States government had boycotted Haiti since it became the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere in 1803. We boycotted it till 1863 when President Lincoln recognized it and sent Frederick Douglass to be our first ambassador. And during the Wilson administration, we sent Marines in to take over security of Haiti, and they were there for about 15 years. And they did provide overall order and provide sort of a sense of peace and order in Haiti, but they didn't do much. The United States government didn't do much to train Haiti to administer itself or to become a democracy during that period. And you know, a lot of members of Congress noted this in congressional reports prior to World War II, that we kind of failed Haiti in that respect. But this intervention really goes back to refugees. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, thousands of Haitians were risking their lives to get out of Haiti and get to Florida primarily. There's a large number of Haitians that did make it eventually up to Canada, and the largest expatriate communities for Haiti are in the United States and in Haiti today. But this is an example of a peacekeeping operations that we undertook and then we passed on to the United Nations that does benefit the United States interest. And I'd say in the 1990s, tens of thousands of Haitians had fled across the Caribbean to get to Florida. And the United States Coast Guard, part of this intervention, intercepted about 67,000 Haitians and returned them to Haiti. In 1994, the United States intervened by sending 22,000 soldiers and Marines to Haiti. At first, it was going to almost be a forced entry by parachutists from the 82nd Airborne Division and soldiers from 10th Mountain were going to go in by helicopter as if they were Marines. But President Carter negotiated the abdication of the ruling military junta, but he also negotiated some rules of engagement that severely restricted the freedom of U.S. forces. So when they landed on the island, they were confronted with some ongoing human rights violations by Haitian police where they couldn't do anything. By the rules that we had signed off to get the abdication of the junta, we weren't able to actually do things to protect the lives of civilians who were, soldiers could see civilians being abused by Haitian authorities. They weren't allowed to use any force to stop it. That was a huge problem initially. But this intervention did return President Aristide to Haiti. He was the first elected president of Haiti. And after a couple of years, we were able to transition it to the United Nations. And there's been several United Nations operations off and on since there. The United Nations actually was in Haiti from 1995, and we passed it off to them to 2001. And then they returned in 2004 because violence broke out again in Haiti. And again, this isn't a war between states, but this is violence between gangs. A lot of these gangs were people that had, some of the older members had been part of the Haitian army, which had been disbanded by Aristide. Today, there's more than 9,000 United Nations peacekeepers in Haiti. 7,000 of those are soldiers, 2,000 of those are police. And up till the earthquake, about 32 of them had died fighting Haitian gangs. And a few, I'm not sure the number, but I think their commanding general was actually killed in the earthquake. And many others were also killed or injured in the earthquake, along with the 200,000 or so Haitians that died in that terrible tragedy. Immediately after that earthquake, the United States military sent about 2,000 soldiers in to help secure delivery of humanitarian assistance. You know, they would escorting food through gang-controlled territories to refugee camps, and help in recovering of bodies, helping to clear streets of rubble and such. And we were all out within about 90 days, and everything we turned back over to the United Nations mission there and the government of Haiti. This is a mixed success, mixed failure. United Nations has done as much as it could to keep peace there and to promote economic development. United States Agency for International Development has done a lot to promote economic development and democracy in Haiti, but it's still a very poor country, still with a high level of criminal violence, and still many people want to leave and come to America or go to Canada. Bosnia, I mentioned earlier, we were slow to get there because we had suffered some setbacks in Somalia, and I think there was a sense in America that just as I think President Johnson had said he wanted to let Asian boys fight Asian wars, I think a lot of Americans thought, well, this was a European problem, the Europeans should solve it. But we did get involved eventually. This is, I think during this conflict, prior to the Dayton Accords, it was estimated about 200,000 civilians and militia members died between the Serb, Muslim, and the Serbs, Bosnian, and Croatian population, and about 2 million citizens of the former different Yugoslav republics became displaced. In the capital of Bosnia, Sarajevo was ruined and bombed, and it was under siege by Serb militias for about a 2-year period. In August of '95, there was a shelling of a marketplace in Sarajevo that caught the attention of the international community. And of course, there are other European countries already were sending peacekeepers into Bosnia at this time, but the United States had yet to become really involved until the bombing of the Sarajevo marketplace. Anyway, this shelling and other incidents in the press in the United States giving more coverage to what was happening finally got the American government to intervene. The troops in NATO, their first mission was to separate the warring parties, the militias, and we also collected as heavy weapons that these militias turned in voluntarily under the Dayton Accords, and we put them in cantonment areas where we accounted for them, knew what was there. We also started to destroy a lot of the weapons. We had a lot of civil affairs personnel and NATO member development agencies went into Bosnia and Herzegovina and worked with the various ethnic groups to try to improve their living conditions. And it wasn't just NATO countries involved. The Russian brigade worked closely with the United States soldiers. A lot of Polish troops were in there before Poland was a NATO member. And we were in there in a large way till December of '04. And that's when we cut down our contribution to about 700 troops. And today, we're down to 9 soldiers and officers that augment the NATO headquarters in Sarajevo there for that mission. But a lot of things we did, you see up there, we helped organize and secure voter registration in the elections, and elections almost became an annual occurrence throughout the Balkans. We also helped secure economic development efforts, And we also had plans to capture identified war criminals, persons identified for war crimes or PIFWICs, and we prevented the violence along ethnic and religious lines. I'd have to rank this as a success. We got in there late, but our contribution to NATO was key, and it has prevented the continued mass atrocities and violence and fighting that was going on in Bosnia and other parts of the Balkans at that time. The complications of this is that it's a never-ending mission for our European partners. I think there's many people that believe that if the remaining 7,000 NATO troops pulled out of Bosnia, that these ethnic groups would probably return to the fight. Okay, Kosovo, sanctioned by United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244. The military technical agreement, to explain that was almost not quite a peace treaty, but it was an agreement that was signed between NATO and the Serbian army to cover the withdrawal of the Serb military and the Serb special police from Kosovo. Under that military technical agreement, we established a ground safety zone between Kosovo and the rest of Serbia, and we also made provisions to allow the Serbian army to provide guards on its approximately 900 patrimonial sites. And the patrimonial site basically, and 900 comes from Encyclopedia Britannica. They counted them all. These are churches and monasteries that were built in the 13th century onward, very ancient, cultural properties recognized by UNESCO. And the initial intervention was well over 7,000 soldiers in a relatively small area, and that was the U.S. component. The first 2 years are about 35,000 NATO soldiers in an area the size of Connecticut, and that's a lot of military. Today, we only have about 700 soldiers there, all from our National Guard, and most of them are at Camp Bondsteel, which is about 11 miles from the Serb, maybe 15 miles from the Serb border, and the rest, there's about 50 or so that work in Pristina at the NATO headquarters there. Pretty much the same mission that we had in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We helped work with the Office for Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe to set up elections, to the voter registration piece for that, and we helped with economic development, and we ended up protecting patrimonial sites because we thought it was going to be too inflammatory to have Serb soldiers inside Kosovo guarding those sites. Some will cite this intervention as a successful example of what the United States Army calls mass atrocity response operations, or our attempt at genocide prevention. And I think Samantha Power has a chapter devoted to Kosovo in her book, A Problem from Hell, that specifically talks about Kosovo. And if you go to this link here, I'm not sure how to do it on this one. I probably lost my show there. Can you click on this link here? And you can download a free copy of our mass atrocity response operations. And this is a book that we wrote with the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard University. And basically the idea of this book was to provide us a guideline so that we didn't have to start from scratch if the United States government did decide that they were going to intervene in another country to prevent a genocide or a mass atrocity. And the thought was that maybe if we had something like this, if we thought about the problem we would have been able to respond better to a situation like Rwanda when we had plenty of advanced warning, or we might have been able to do more than we had done earlier and done it earlier in Bosnia as well. Thank you. And now today, I talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm in no way going to say that they're a peacekeeping operation, but this is one reason why we're not doing so many of them, because we're doing so much of this. At our peak, we had 160,000 U.S. Uniformed personnel in Iraq and a significant number of contractors. And right now, we have 50,000 soldiers there as part of Operation New Dawn. Not supposed to be involved in direct combat. They are supposed to be able to defend themselves, however, and their mission might be similar to what we see happening in the Republic of Korea right now today, where we've been there for 60 years in a similar role, helping preserve peace in Korea. Similar role here in many cases, but the real focus of what we're doing in Iraq is to reinforce their own security forces. And right now in Iraq, I think we're taking an appropriate back seat to the government of Iraq and its security forces, and we're providing technical support, logistical support, intelligence support to the Iraqi army and police and the civilian government that they work for. In Afghanistan, we still lead a lot of the combat against both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but our intent is to build up the security capacity and the governance institutions of the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan so that they can take care of those issues for them. I'd say on a daily basis, what our soldiers have been doing for the last, the majority of our soldiers for the last 5 or 6 years in Iraq, and the majority of our soldiers and Marines also in Afghanistan are more likely to be doing stability operations than combat operations. And what I've listed there are our military stability tasks according to the United States Army doctrine. Establish civil security is pretty much filling the vacuum of police and military within a state, and almost gets back to the whole aspect we discussed with earlier presentations of human security, that we're not just defending territory, we're trying to protect the citizens of that territory. Establish civilian control is a little bit more advanced, and that's something that the military supports but cannot do by itself, and that's concentrating on justice reform and rule of law. That gets into training police, it gets into training judges, it gets into training prison guards and wardens, and building a complete justice system which has those three parts: the police, the courts, and the prisons. And in restoring essential services, in the United States military, we have this acronym SWEAT, which applies mostly to a larger urban environment such as Kabul or Baghdad. S for sewer, W is for water, E is for electric, A is for academics, and T is for trash or sanitation. But those are some of the essential services that we see that we have to help fix to help remove some of the frustrations that might lead to violent conflict. In fact, I think in 2004, 2005, General Chiarelli thought that he was dealing with an insurgency that was motivated just by poor sanitation in Baghdad. And so that's become a big part of what we do. Supporting governance, that gets for us into supporting, again, the election process, the voter registration process, and restoring public administration, helping to train people in public administration. United States military will usually do this in coordination with the United States Agency for International Development and its implementing partners. A lot of non-governmental organizations that will specialize in training less developed societies in these tasks. We're helping to replace human capital that's been lost during conflict by training new human capital. And in supporting economic and infrastructure development, that's basically expanding services to where they weren't before, expanding markets, expanding transportation, and by making things better for the whole country, giving everyone a stake in peace. But again, the cost of what we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan has limited our direct support to a lot of other United Nations or regional peacekeeping operations. So the only ones that we really have personnel directly participating in uniform would be Kosovo with National Guard soldiers, and our multinational force observers in the Sinai, also National Guard soldiers. And other than that, we have a few officers that serve as UN military observers, but no significant troop contributions because of the resources we've expended here. Now we'll talk a little bit about what we do in supporting UN and regional peacekeeping operations, because this really is the main focus of what the United States is doing now. I know PKSOI, my organization, has a close working relationship with UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. We've coordinated doctrine writing sessions with them and that help them produce materials that help them train their peacekeepers. As of August of this year, there's over 99, almost 100,000 UN peacekeepers and personnel. About almost 84,000 of those are soldiers, and almost 14,000 of those are police officers. There's also about 2,000 observers, and the United States government itself pays 27% of this annual budget for all these operations, regardless of where they're at. And again, as I mentioned, we do a lot of education and training with UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And we also work a lot, we've helped train some UN police trainers that supported the mission in Darfur. And we also helped with the preparing people for the Global Peace Operations Initiative, or GPOI, which is a United States Department of State initiative that trains foreign militaries to provide soldiers for UN peacekeeping missions. Another way that we support United Nations and regional peacekeeping operations is through our participation in the Challenges Forum for Peacekeeping. And that's run out of the, the Folk Bernadette Academy in Switzerland. And it currently has 16 partner nations. They're all listed there. And again, this is about training other peacekeeping forces, both tactics and techniques, but also the law of war, how to act responsibly. In the Western Hemisphere, working with the United States Army South, we participate in the Conference of American Armies. There's 20 member armies in this, mostly from Central and South America. And this is a forum where first it allows the officers and NCOs from all these different armies to meet each other informally and formally. And so that, in a way, also helps in those societies and those countries prevent conflict breaking out. It has a strong focus on peacekeeping operations and humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And a lot of it gets back to helping to write a shared doctrine for all these countries, so when they have to support an operation together, they all have the same rules, the same tactics and techniques. Peacekeeping Americas is another program that's led by United States Army South that we support. We work with 16 regional peace operating training centers in different countries in Central and South America that train soldiers to go on peacekeeping missions. Colombia is one of the armies that I mentioned sends soldiers to the Sinai. Well, they're going to get some of their training at one of these peace operations training centers. It's a three-stage program that we've been supporting. First stage is to improve all the peace training centers so that they're all teaching a standard curriculum. They all have a certain level of equipment and logistics training. And then the platoon situational training exercises is to train down to platoon level, which is about between 30 and 50 soldiers, depending upon the particular army, on how to conduct patrols and checkpoints and such. And then battalion peacekeeping operations command post exercises to train colonels, lieutenant colonels on how to run a command post that would control 9 to 15 platoons engaged in peacekeeping operations. TEPSO is the training and education for peace support operations. This is a NATO European-focused operation that we participate in. And again, this is all about training people. The CCOE, that's the CIMIC Center of Excellence. CIMIC is the NATO version of what we call civil military operations, getting the military to work with the host nation civilians and with the NGO community during combat operations or post-combat operations. And they have a CIMIC school in the Netherlands where they train officers specifically going to Afghanistan to serve in stability operations there, and they provide a lot of support to Afghanistan. And we have continual training and education relationships with both these programs. And getting towards the end here, again, this is the State Department program I mentioned, and I would have to say this is a pretty good success because the Government Accounting Office didn't think they were going to reach their goal of training 100,000 peacekeepers by 2010, but they're actually ahead of that. They've trained over 113,000. And they've actually, and these soldiers are already participating in operations already. And since 2005, this program, funded through the State Department, has helped deploy over 100,000 soldiers to 20 different peacekeeping operations across the world. And it's been, I'd have to say this is a success. This is 100,000 foreign soldiers, not Americans, that are going out and preventing conflict, and that's a big win-win. They do it much more cheaply than the American military can, and saves a lot of American lives. These are some of the faces of the global program for Global Peace Operations Initiative, and I'd have to say it is a success. Dr. Wren mentioned earlier safeguarding the seaways. GPOI is involved in some of that. They do a lot of humanitarian mine action, a lot of training of peacekeepers. ACOTA goes back to the Clinton administration, and again, it started in 1997, and their goal was to train 300,000 peacekeepers by 2017. A lot of ACOTA has been rolled up under GPOI, so we've got 7 years to train about another 180,000 peacekeepers. At the rate we're going, we might get there. I mean, it's challenging. It's a lot of people to train, but you can see the partners that we have, and it's I would say overall this is a success for us. And then I'm only going to look at a couple of specific operations before I end. I just listed UNMID, United Nations Assistance Mission to Darfur, mainly because it ties into MARO, or genocide prevention, and it also kind of highlights another way we support peacekeeping without actually sending soldiers and Marines there. Even before UNMID, when there was just UNAMIS in the Sudan, the United States Air Force was flying peacekeepers from Rwanda into the Sudan to help carry out their peacekeeping mission. And right now, Rwanda's got about, I think, Their current rotation is almost, well, 3,600 plus soldiers, which is a fair amount of the over 21,000 that are in defer right now. And it's not just a military event. And down at the bottom, you'll see some trainers from the United States Institute of Peace that are teaching conflict resolution to soldiers from the Rwandan military before they go for their mission. And the Rwandan military itself is interesting because it's a new army built of the former Tutsi army of the that would actually came from Uganda in the 90s, and the Hutu army that was the old army of the Rwanda prior to and to the genocide. And so you have soldiers that fought each other tooth and nail that are now actually fighting and dying in some cases in defer, protecting other human beings from the genocide that they experienced less than 15 years ago. I mentioned support to Amazon just because my friend Steve Smith there got sent to Burundi in January this year to help train them for their assumption of that mission. Burundi's another army that went through, another country that went through genocide. And again, you have an army that has Rwandans and Tutsis in it, and it's fighting very hard in Somalia against Al-Shabaab. And again, this mission is sanctioned by the United States, the United Nations Security Council. But this is not considered, you don't see United Nations in the mission name. So it's supported by the United Nations, but not the same degree as a UN named mission. It gets a lot of funding from the United States. As mentioned earlier, the mission has been promised more troops. I think the troops they have now are all from Uganda and Burundi. I think Guinea has promised more troops. I would have to say in many ways it's a success. It's a brave attempt because they're attempting to do with 8,000 troops when they get them all what we had trouble doing with 37,000 troops. And they are doing their best to keep peace in Somalia, but at the same time, it has devolved into a continual gunfight for them. Anyway, that concludes my my little dissertation on what the United States has done as far as peacekeeping operations and support to other militaries that are involved in peace support operations. And appreciate any questions or comments or criticisms from the real experts in the room that live a lot closer to this than I do.
Colonel Groves, thank you very much. And it's time for questions, if anybody has any. I know I have one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any plans in the making for prospective peacekeeping operations in the Philippines that you're aware of.
Not that I'm aware of. We've done a lot of training with the Philippine Army, and we've had civil affairs working in the Philippines and information operations, military information support operations troops that we used to call psychological operations troops working in the Philippines.
In Mindanao or?
Yes, but they've been very careful to be a strictly advisory role. Mm-hmm. Our measure of success for the Philippine government is that we never have to get involved in the fighting, because once we get involved in the fighting, it diminishes their legitimacy and their, I guess, their monopoly on violence, I guess, on state violence if we have to support them. Right. And for the most part, they've done a good job.
Thank you. You mentioned the United Nations Command in South Korea, and I suppose the question will also apply to the multinational force observers in the Sinai. But the United Nations Command seems to imply that the United Nations is in charge. Are U.S. troops answering to UN commanders' orders? or are they only answering to U.S. generals?
Yes and yes, because the commander of United Nations Command is the commander of United States Forces Korea. The first commander of United Nations Command was General MacArthur back in 1950, and that command has always been commanded by a United States four-star.
And that's authorized. I mean, the UN designates an American general always to be in charge.
Yes, and again, you won't even see this discussed on the United Nations websites. When you go to, you might find a reference to the United Nations cemetery in Busan, where there's several thousand United Nations soldiers that died during the fighting there. They're buried, but the United Nations itself, I think, for the most part, doesn't stay actively involved in this at all. And there's no continuing resolution or anything like that, like there is for other peacekeeping missions where they're renewed on an annual or semi-annual basis.
Is that command and control of U.S. forces always prevalent in the same way as the Sinai and all the other places you mentioned?
No, well, the Sinai is not actually a United Nations mission, and I think they actually went in with, I think, kind of bright orange berets because that was specific to Israel and Egypt, and so it's not actually a UN mission.
Okay.
Other questions?
I think that you can probably hear my voice. That's okay. Everybody hear me?
No, nobody can hear you.
Colonel, thank you for coming. I have a lot of questions, but I want to ask more specific about Bosnia. You mentioned that the U.S. is after war criminals. And I guess I'd like you to address that with specific reference to Radovan Karadzic and Milosevic. You know, we erected 1-800 posters. We were trying to go after these people and give these numbers that the phone numbers really only worked in the United States. I wonder if we really did go after the war criminals in the Balkans, and I recognize that you're representing a military viewpoint, why we haven't signed the International Criminal Court.
Well, you know, we did go after the war criminals, and of course, the Serbs, I think, kind of turned over Milosevic to the Hague, and I think he eventually died before his trial was completed. And probably, you know, the phones answering in the United States, it probably just had to deal with our IT structure at the time and our inability to figure those things out. And I honestly don't know that we actually caught too many. I think maybe the French or some other European nation may have caught one or two of them. And as far as the international criminal courts, I think there's always that issue of United States leadership, and there's probably other countries besides the United States that haven't signed on to it, that feel it's too easy for it to become politicized. And I guess a good example is I think General Franks was brought up on charges by an attorney in Belgium after you know, the invasion of Iraq, and I guess, you know, different people, you know, even with had made similar complaints about President Bush for whatever, and I think a lot of American, you know, for policy reasons, they thought that it was more political than that it would be too politicized, that, you know, you wouldn't really get justice for anyone in many cases. And the American military itself, when it finds that its soldier has done something wrong, it tries them, it sends them to prison. And we did that in Iraq in a few incidents, and we have, I think, trials going on that right now related to incidents in Afghanistan where soldiers have committed crime, and they will face justice.
Thank you, Colonel. I have a question largely relating to terminology, but also impacts how we would come to our conclusions about successes and failures. I realize that you work for the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, but as you know, in the field of peace studies, we often we often differentiate between peacekeeping and peace building efforts. And I'm wondering, can you tell me more about how the U.S. Army and the government defines the concept of peace? When you say we're successful in this scenario, when we've created peace, does that mean we've stopped violence, or that we have actually created the conditions of human security? And
for us, it would, it'd be both, because that gets back to our first stability task that I listed earlier. And and I think someone made a good distinction with earlier presentations of what human security was. And I've heard more expanded versions that used to we would go and say, well, as long as we prevent one nation from invading another, as long as we're that buffer state, we're providing, that's peacekeeping or whatever. But the human security was, okay, we're going to go into a country and we're going to protect everyone, not just we're going to, and this is a distinction I make, when we went into Haiti the first time. And I don't know, some of you may remember video clips on the news of soldiers from 10th Mountain Division standing behind a hurricane fence and they're watching a Haitian policeman beat a guy to death. They're not allowed to do anything because the rules of engagement they have been given told them that they cannot, they can use deadly force to protect themselves, but they cannot use deadly force to protect someone else who's being, beaten to death by a uniformed cop. And that was pretty traumatic for all those soldiers to watch it, knowing that they're not legally allowed to get involved to save this life. And I don't know why the guy was being beaten. The Haitian cop probably thought he had a good reason, but you know what? He was probably a little bit excessive. And so I think that the human security, this idea of going in and you save everyone's life, it's sort of like the UN peacekeepers in Rwanda. First they didn't have the forces and the equipment to deal with what they were seeing. They would just be totally wiped out. But second, their nations that sent them there would not allow them to intervene. They weren't given the UN mandate that allowed them to use deadly force to prevent one Rwandan from murdering another Rwandan with a machete. And so the United Nations, under now Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, is trying to take steps to change that. The Rwandans have said since day one, when they were part of the mission in Sudan, that they would use deadly force to prevent genocide in that country. But so as far as human security, that aspect, I think we're trying to accommodate that now, because we are going. That is a stability task for us now, is to protect civilians from violence, organized violence in a country. There's more expanded versions of human security I've heard, where it's like, everyone's got to have a job. It's things that we can't do in this country, though we try. So, but as far as peace building, we try to work hand in hand with our civilian agencies. The United States Agency for International Development does a lot of work with a variety of its enabling partners in trying to train other societies on how to resolve their conflicts without resorting to violence. And we work hand in hand with those organizations and provide them the best support that we can.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel. If you study United Nations peacekeeping and contributions to United Nations peacekeeping, you find that after in the post-Cold War era, Western nations provided most of the UN peacekeepers. Since the mid-1990s, that changed dramatically, and you find that developing nations are now providing the bulk of UN peacekeepers. The Somali effect is one of the things, and I think you mentioned that. Now, you also, you cannot say, however, that Western nations are not providing peacekeepers, because you rightly pointed out that there are many peacekeepers in many places. You see nowadays more EU operations, also in Africa. You talk about Afghanistan and Iraq and those places. But and in addition to that, you also find more and more that the African Union are conducting peacekeeping operations. In all of this, and that brings me back to the conference and the whole issue of supranational organizations. Where does that leave the UN in all of this? Because more and more we see hybrid peacekeeping. Sometimes Sudan is a case in point, Darfur, and we see more and more non-UN peacekeeping operations. But again, where does that leave the UN?
Well, I think the UN, within many Western democracies, well, many countries that aren't democracies, the UN resolution still conveys a big sense of legitimacy to the people of those countries or the leadership of those countries. And that was a big problem for President Bush trying to go into Iraq in 2003, trying to get a UN resolution to authorize him to do that. And it was very important to many members of Congress that he get that. And you mentioned the AU is doing, I think, a very brave effort in Somalia. And they have a UN resolution that tells them they can do that, but it's not necessarily, I mean, it's not a UN mission per se. It's authorized, but that sanction means a lot to the African Union. And so I think it's just an institution that does convey a legitimacy, and it conveys that what we've talking about doing has been discussed with leadership of many countries, and to include a lot of democracies.
Bryan, thank you very much for your talk. This concludes our session. I'll ask you again to please fill out the survey forms at your table, and we will reconvene at the next session. 2:30. Thank you very much.